There's a comforting fiction that has long sustained the Canadian imagination, a belief rooted more in sentiment than in the hard arithmetic of power, which assumes that the colossal neighbor to the south is not merely a trading partner, but a permanent, benevolent guarantor of Canadian prosperity. For generations, Canadians have looked at the map and seen the longest undefended border in the world, treating it as a monument to an inevitable and everlasting friendship. But history is rarely sentimental, and as we examine the trajectory of American politics today, specifically the return of a fiercely transactional nationalism under Donald Trump, we must confront a stark reality that Mark Carney has recently articulated with chilling clarity. The era of the automatic exemption is over. The assumption that Canada is family and therefore safe from the sharp elbows of American protectionism is a dangerous nostalgia. What we are witnessing and what Carney has identified is not merely a trade dispute or a renegotiation of tariffs. It is the potential dismantling of the economic ecosystem that has allowed Canada to punch above its weight for nearly a century. When a figure as central to the global financial establishment as Mark Carney, a man who has steered the central banks of both Canada and Great Britain, signals that the global environment Canada once relied on has fundamentally changed. Canadians would be wise to listen. He is not a man prone to hyperbole. He is a creature of data, of risk assessment, and of institutional stability. So when he warns that long-standing assumptions about stability and partnership can no longer be taken for granted, he is effectively saying that the foundation of the Canadian house is cracking. Consider for a moment what it means when the United States, the gravitational center of Canada's economic universe, adopts what Carney calls a more transactional, pressure-based approach to global affairs. For decades, the integration of the North American economy was designed to be seamless. The auto worker in Ontario and the parts manufacturer in Michigan were part of a single synchronized organism. The flow of energy, timber, and capital was lubricated by a shared belief in the rule of law and mutual benefit. But Donald Trump represents a distinct break from the post-1945 consensus. He views trade not as a cooperative tide that lifts all boats, but as a zero-sum contest, where for one side to win, the other must emphatically lose. In this worldview, Canada's trade surplus with the United States is not a sign of a healthy partnership. It is treated as a theft, a grievance to be rectified with the blunt instrument of tariffs. Carney points out that every country connected to such a power must adapt, and Canada is no exception. The danger here is existential, because Canada has allowed itself to become uniquely vulnerable. When you export the vast majority of your goods to a single customer, and that customer decides to rewrite the terms of the deal based on political whim rather than economic logic, you are not a partner. You are a hostage. This is the hidden story that gets lost in the daily noise of tweets and campaign rallies. We tend to focus on the personality of Donald Trump, his rhetoric, his unpredictability. But the deeper issue is the institutional shift he embodies. He has exposed the fragility of the international rules-based order upon which a middle power like Canada relies. Powerful nations do not need rules. They have power. It is the smaller nations, the trading nations, the Canada of the world that rely on rules to level the playing field. When the United States signals that it is willing to bypass the World Trade Organization, to leverage national security as a pretext for economic protectionism, and to treat allies as rivals, the rulebook is burned. Carney's message is that Canada is now operating in a vacuum. The global environment is shifting from one of multilateral cooperation to one of bilateral coercion. And yet the reaction from many in Ottawa and across the provinces has often been one of denial, a hope that if we simply keep our heads down, the storm will pass, or that the special relationship will save us. Carney is telling Canadians that hope is not a strategy. He argues that dependency is no longer a safe strategy. This is a profound indictment of the status quo. It suggests that the very structure of the Canadian economy, built on easy access to the American market, has become a liability. We must understand the mechanics of how this destruction could unfold. It does not necessarily require a formal declaration of trade war. The mere uncertainty, the threat of a 10% universal tariff, or the specific targeting of the automotive sector freezes investment. Capital is cowardly. It flees from uncertainty. If a business cannot know whether the border will remain open next year or whether a sudden executive order from the White House will render their supply chain illegal, they will not build that factory in Ontario. They will build it in Ohio or Tennessee to be inside the fortress walls. This is the silent erosion of Canada's future. It is the slow bleed of productivity and innovation south of the border, driven not by Canadian failure, but by American unpredictability. Carney frames this clearly. The world is shifting, and we are seeing a move away from the stability we once took for granted. But his analysis goes deeper than just ringing the alarm bell. He is suggesting that the remedy, and indeed the only path to survival, requires a psychological break from the United States. He speaks of a Canada that is increasingly confident and ambitious, looking towards Asia, the European Union, and the Gulf. This sounds optimistic, perhaps even aspirational, but implicit in this pivot is a terrifying admission. The American century is ending for Canada. The good news Carney cites, that the Philippines, Thailand, and the Gulf states want to do more with Canada, is born of necessity. Canada must find new friends because the old friend has become unreliable. As we walk through this, consider how this affects your community. If you work in manufacturing, in agriculture, in energy, your livelihood is likely tethered to that border. The powerful warning we are discussing today is not just about GDP statistics. It is about the viability of the Canadian standard of living. For generations, that standard of living has been subsidized by the efficiency of the North American market. If that market fractures, the cost of goods rises, the value of the dollar fluctuates, and the certainty of employment vanishes. Carney's argument is that Canada is adjusting deliberately rather than reacting emotionally. But we must ask if the adjustment is fast enough. The speed at which the Trump administration, or any administration embracing this new economic nationalism, can inflict damage is far greater than the speed at which Canada can build new ports to ship liquid natural gas to Germany or negotiate free trade agreements with Indonesia. We are in a race between political disruption and economic diversification. Carney notes that major investments are flowing in from places like the UAE, which has committed $7 billion to Canada. This is significant, but it is a drop in the bucket compared to the daily volume of trade that crosses the Detroit-Windsor Bridge. We are talking about replacing the circulatory system of the economy while the patient is still on the operating table. Furthermore, this situation reveals a crisis of identity. Canada has often defined itself in contrast to the United States, more orderly, more collective, more polite, while quietly enjoying the protection of the American security umbrella and the engine of the American consumer. If those benefits are withdrawn, what is left? Carney suggests a Canada that acts as a reliable partner to the rest of the world, offering stability and skilled labor in an unpredictable era. He is sketching a vision of Canada as a sanctuary of sanity in a world gone mad. But virtue alone does not pay the bills. The hard truth is that the network Carney describes expanding, reach outward to reduce vulnerability, is a project of decades, not election cycles, and the threat is immediate. The destruction we are contemplating is the unraveling of the social contract that relies on a wealthy trading economy to fund the healthcare, education, and social programs that Canadians cherish. Without the wealth generated by trade, the institutions of the state begin to starve. So when we talk about Trump's actions destroying Canada, we are not talking about military conquest. We are talking about the suffocation of the Canadian model through economic isolation. This is the precipice upon which the nation stands, and it is why Carney's intervention is so critical. He is trying to wake a slumbering country to the fact that the old maps no longer describe the territory we are navigating. What Carney has effectively done is shatter the polite silence that usually governs diplomatic discourse between allies. In the official language of statecraft, we are accustomed to hearing platitudes about shared history and interwoven economies. Carney, however, has stepped forward to articulate the quiet anxiety that keeps deputy ministers awake at night. The realization that the United States is no longer a champion of the open global order, but arguably its most potent disruptor. When he speaks of a global environment that has fundamentally changed, he is referring to the collapse of the consensus that free trade prevents conflict. We have moved from an era of integration to an era of fragmentation. The official event here is not just a speech, it is a declaration of independence from the psychological comfort of the past. Carney is defining the core controversy of our time for Canada: how to remain a sovereign, prosperous nation when your primary partner decides that your prosperity is a threat to their own. To understand the gravity of this, you must look at the institutional machinery that is now at risk. For decades, the North American economy functioned like a grand, intricate clockwork mechanism. Parts crossed the border multiple times before a final car rolled off the assembly line. This was made possible by institutions like the World Trade Organization and agreements like NAFTA, which provided a rule book. If there was a dispute, you went to a tribunal, you argued the law, and you accepted the ruling. It was boring, it was bureaucratic, and it was magnificent because it was predictable. But in a transactional world, the world Donald Trump inhabits and shapes, rules are for suckers. In this new paradigm, economic leverage is a weapon. If you have the bigger market, you dictate the terms. This is the pressure-based approach Carney warns of. It replaces the rule of law with the rule of strength. And for a country of 40 million living next to a country of 330 million, a contest of strength is a contest you cannot win. You can only survive it by changing the game. This brings us to the background, the long, slow drift that brought us to this precipice. It would be a mistake to think this started solely with Donald Trump. The currents of protectionism have been swirling in American politics for years, fed by the hollowing out of the Rust Belt and a growing suspicion that global trade was a rigged game that benefited elites while punishing workers. Trump did not invent this anger. He merely weaponized it. But where previous administrations tried to manage these tensions within the existing system, the Trump doctrine is to smash the system and see what pieces can be picked up. We saw the preview of this during the renegotiation of NAFTA, a bruising, chaotic process that traumatized Canadian negotiators and left the country with a profound sense of vulnerability. We told ourselves then that we had secured a deal, that the storm had passed. But agreements in this new era are written in sand, not stone. The upcoming review clauses, the constant threat of executive actions, these are the swords of Damocles hanging over the Canadian economy. Why should you, the viewer, care about these high-level ruminations? Because the abstract concept of institutional stability translates directly into the concrete reality of your daily life. When Carney talks about economic exposure, he is talking about your mortgage. If the Canadian dollar collapses because trade flows are choked off, the cost of everything you import, from winter vegetables to electronics, spikes. Inflation, which we have fought so hard to tame, returns with a vengeance. If the auto plants in Ontario close because they can no longer export freely to the U.S., the ripple effects devastate not just the workers on the line, but the truck drivers, the local diners, the accountants, and the tax base that funds your local schools. This is the human impact hidden behind the jargon of macroeconomics. A trade war is not fought in boardrooms. It is fought in the aisles of your grocery store and on the balance sheets of your small businesses. Carney's argument, however, is not one of despair. It is an argument for repositioning. This is a crucial distinction. Retreat implies failure. Repositioning implies strategy. He points out that major investments are flowing in from the European Union, the UK, and the Gulf states. This is the mechanics of survival in action. By courting investment from the United Arab Emirates or deepening ties with the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, Canada is attempting to build a system of redundant safeguards. Think of it as an insurance policy. If the American house catches fire, you want to make sure you have somewhere else to sleep. Carney is highlighting that Canada has what the world wants: energy, critical minerals, food, and stability. In a chaotic world, stability commands a premium. The challenge is to convert that potential into actual contracts, actual shipping lanes, and actual relationships that are robust enough to withstand the pressure from the South. But we must be honest about the difficulty of this pivot. You cannot simply flip a switch and replace the American market. Geography is a stubborn thing. The logic of North-South trade is written in the rivers, the rails, and the roads that connect us. To turn east and west to look across the oceans requires a massive investment in infrastructure, pipelines, ports, terminals that Canada has historically struggled to build. We are a nation that loves process and fears construction. Carney's vision requires a Canada that can actually get things done, a country that prioritizes ambition over procedural paralysis. He is asking for a cultural shift as much as an economic one. He is telling us that the luxury of dithering is gone. If we want to be independent, we have to build the capacity for independence. This leads us to the question of sovereignty. For a long time, Canadian sovereignty was a polite fiction. We were sovereign because the Americans allowed us to be, and because it was in their interest to have a stable, friendly neighbor. But if that neighbor becomes hostile or indifferent, sovereignty becomes something you have to earn every single day. It requires investments in defense, not just to please NATO, but to ensure, as Carney puts it, that Canada is never forced to rely entirely on the goodwill of others. This is a harder, colder reality than many Canadians are used to. It demands that we stop looking at defense spending as a distraction from social programs and start seeing it as the rent we pay for our national existence. The Arctic, which Carney specifically mentions, is the perfect example. It is a region of immense strategic importance, yet for decades we have guarded it with little more than rhetoric. In a world of great power competition, rhetoric is not a deterrent. We must also be careful to distinguish between the necessary actions Carney describes and the political noise that surrounds them. There is a temptation to view every move by Donald Trump as a personal slight against Canada, or to view every Canadian response as a partisan maneuver by the current government. We should resist that simplification. The forces at work here are larger than any two men. They are structural. The shift toward a fragmented world where power is being exercised more openly and rules are being tested was underway before the latest election cycle and will continue long after it. The responsibility of the Canadian voter, your responsibility, is to demand that your leaders take this structural shift seriously rather than using it for short-term political gain. We need a foreign policy that is bipartisan, consistent, and funded for the long haul, not one that changes with the polling winds. This is the mechanics of how it actually worked in the past. We assumed goodwill. We underinvested in our own hard power, and we allowed our economic veins to flow almost exclusively south. That system worked until it did not. Now the incentives have reversed. The incentive now is to be increasingly confident and to have ambition, not out of vanity, but out of necessity. The hidden story here is that Canada is finally being forced to grow up. We are seeing the end of the post-war vacation from history. Carney's warning is effectively a notice of eviction from the comfortable mental space we have inhabited for 70 years. As we look at the wider consequences, we must understand that this matters beyond just one election or one trade dispute. It touches on the very nature of the Canadian experiment. If we fail to adapt, if we fail to build this network of new partners and capabilities, the consequences will not just be higher tariffs. It will be a gradual loss of national agency. We will become a rule taker rather than a rule maker, subject to the whims of powers that do not share our interests or our values. Carney speaks of a Canada that intends to shape outcomes alongside others, and that intention is the critical pivot point. Without it, we are merely driftwood in a turbulent ocean. With it, we have a chance to steer. But let us not lose sight of the human face of this geopolitical abstraction. When we speak of sovereignty and strategic pivots, we risk obscuring the reality that these high-level decisions land squarely on the kitchen tables of everyday Canadians. The human impact of a fractured relationship with the United States is not measured in diplomatic cables, but in the anxiety of the assembly line worker in Windsor, who wonders if his shift will exist next year. It is measured in the calculations of the prairie farmer who needs to know if the border will be open for her grain, or if a sudden tweet from the White House will leave her harvest rotting in the silo. These are the real people caught in the tectonic grind between Canadian necessity and American nationalism. When Carney warns of a world that is more transactional, he is warning that the stability which allowed these families to plan their futures, to take out mortgages, to save for tuition, to start businesses, is evaporating. If we allow our economy to remain dangerously exposed to the whims of a single neighbor, it is these citizens who will pay the price. The cost of dependency is ultimately levied on the consumer in the form of higher prices for goods, on the taxpayer in the form of bailouts for battered industries, and on the worker in the form of lost opportunity. We must avoid the dehumanizing language of labor markets, and remember that we are talking about the dignity of work and the security of communities. Carney's call for a confident nation is at its core a call to protect the Canadian standard of living from becoming collateral damage in someone else's trade war. It is an argument that the best way to protect the vulnerable is to build a nation that is robust enough to weather the storm rather than one that merely hopes the storm will pass. This brings us to a necessary system-level reflection. What this entire controversy reveals is a glaring gap between our national ideals and our practical readiness. For too long, there has been a dissonance in the Canadian character. We perceive ourselves as a moral superpower, a broker of peace, and a champion of rules. Yet, we have allowed our capacity to enforce or support those ideals to atrophy. We have relied on the long-standing assumptions Carney mentions to do the heavy lifting for us. Now that those assumptions are crumbling, we are left with a choice. We can retreat into a defensive crouch, blaming the United States for changing the rules and mourning the loss of the old order. Or we can embrace the nuance that Carney is offering. He is suggesting that multiple truths can coexist. We can be a friend to the Americans while refusing to be their dependent. We can be a nation of peace while investing seriously in our own defense. We can be open to the world while being fiercely protective of our own interests. This is the maturation of a country. It is the realization that in a world of sharp elbows, kindness is not a substitute for leverage. The powerful warning is ultimately a challenge to our civic culture. It asks if we are capable of the seriousness required to navigate this new century. Can we have a debate about defense spending that does not devolve into partisan bickering? Can we discuss energy infrastructure and internal trade barriers without paralyzing ourselves with regional grievances? Carney's intervention is a signal that the time for unserious politics is over. The luxury of complacency has been revoked. As we step back and survey the landscape Carney has described, we see a Canada at a crossroads. One path leads to a diminished future where we are a branch plant economy buffeted by the decisions of others, growing slowly poorer and more resentful. The other path, the one Carney points toward, is harder. It requires deliberate adjustment, ambition, and the courage to build new relationships in Asia, the Gulf, and Europe. It requires us to define ourselves not by who we are next to, but by what we bring to the table. It is a path of resilience. I leave you with this thought. The destruction of the old Canadian model that Carney warns about is not necessarily a death sentence. It can be a chrysalis. It can be the pressure that forces us to finally become the sovereign, capable, and diversified power we have always claimed to be. But that transformation is not inevitable. It is a choice, and it is a choice that will be made by the voters, the thinkers, and the citizens who refuse to look away from the reality of the moment. What do you think? Is Canada ready to make the hard pivot away from total reliance on the United States, or are we too culturally and economically set in our ways? Does Mark Carney's vision strike you as a necessary awakening or an impossible dream? I invite you to weigh in, because this conversation about the health of our democracy and the security of our future is only just beginning. If you found this analysis helpful in cutting through the noise, I would ask you to like and subscribe to the channel so we can continue to examine the history, institutions, and choices that shape our world together. Until next time, thank you for watching.